Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
A mysterious phone call that says wife, but what exactly? In today's story, you'll find out what it's about. Enjoy watching it. On a Monday afternoon in early December, I received a call that changed my life. When I answered the phone, the man asked, "Is this Alan Baxter?" "That's true." "Can I help you?" He said, "Lisa Baxter's husband." A little worried, I replied, "Yes." "Is something wrong?" He said, "Sorry, I'm calling to tell you about your wife's inappropriate relationship with a man at Extra Point." I was initially stunned and then annoyed that I had received an obvious prank call. "Who the hell are you, and why are you telling me this crap?" He said, "This is not a prank. Your wife is meeting another guy on Friday night at the disco." I knew it wasn't true, not my wife, but an unpleasant feeling came over me. Something was happening, something I didn't understand. I needed to think, but I needed time. "I'm not alone. Can you call me back in 20 minutes? He said okay and hung up. I stood with the phone in my hand, my arms and legs began to shake. I felt a cold sweat break out, my heart was racing, but my thoughts were like molasses. I sat down and put my head in my hands. There can't be anything wrong with that, can there? I had been married to Lisa for 6.5 years. We have a beautiful 6-year-old daughter named Maddie, who is the center of our world. Yes, Maddie came a little early. Lisa was pregnant when we got married. We met during the fall semester at a local college. Lisa was a first-year nursing student. I had completed a 2-year degree in business and accounting but lost my draft deferment because I was 5 credits behind where selective service regulations said I should be. Even though I lived at home, I worked full-time every other semester to pay my tuition. Vietnam was in full swing, and of course, the draft board was not sympathetic. I just hung around college, taking a couple of classes, but mostly playing cards with my buddies in public places, expecting my draft notice to show up any day. To tell the truth, I was an indifferent student and I was bored with school. I had some money in the bank, I was young, naive, and thought that leaving home and going out into the world wouldn't be such a bad thing. One of the guys I was playing cards with nudged me and said, "Look at this," pointing to the line for the cafeteria. There stood a girl with long brown hair, a short skirt, and magnificent legs. He said, "This is Lisa Hartwell." She was 2 years behind us in high school. As I studied her, I thought, damn, she's cute. As soon as she sat down, we walked over and he introduced me. The 3 of us sat and talked for a while. They both grew up in the same area and mostly talked about their old gang while I listened and admired the view. Finally, she said that she had to go to class, smiled at both of us, and left. I was immediately attracted to her. She was about 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighed 115 pounds, and had the body of a dancer, long and slender. It turned out that dancing was her hobby and she performed in a couple of school musicals. She was not a beauty in the classical sense, but she was attractive and cute. She had a wide smile, an easygoing personality, and obvious intimate appeal. She would talk to anyone and could instantly make you feel like she was interested in you. In high school, you could say I was part of the nerd crowd, not very sociable and had difficulty making new friends. I read a lot but got mediocre grades. I was not lazy, so I always had a job and was proud that I had my own money and my own transportation. Other than one girl I dated for a few months my freshman year, I only dated a few times. I was tall, 6 feet 3 inches, 195 pounds, wore glasses, and looked pretty average. I was interested in sports, but I wasn't very good at it. I never learned to dance, I didn't have an expensive car, and I never played sports. I was comfortable talking to girls, so I never attracted much attention to myself. During my freshman year of college, I dated a girl I met at my summer job. She was pretty smart and a second-year student at a nearby university on a scholarship. She was also very religious. Dancing, drinking, or intim were not part of her belief system. After that, besides school and work, my social activities revolved around hanging out with the guys, beach parties at the lake on the weekends if the weather allowed, the occasional poker night, and college parties. I kind of got into partying more than was good for me. I knew that over the weekend I had seizures. A few days after meeting Lisa, I saw her sitting alone in the common room, so I walked over to her table and sat down. We talked for a bit, and I really felt an attraction. She told me about her decision to become a nurse, having worked in hospitals since she was old enough to deliver candy. She lived at home to save money, as her father was disabled. We talked about our families, and we just hit it off. Finally, I asked her if she wanted to go to a movie and have pizza with me the following weekend. She said she was free on Saturday. I said great, and I would pick her up at 7 o'clock. This is where it all started. After our second date, we parked on one of the country roads and kissed. A couple of weeks later, I was at her house, and we started getting to know each other. Her parents had already gone to bed, but it was a small house. I suggested we go for a ride, so we drove to a secluded forest a few miles away from her place. There, we made love. After that, I was hooked. We talked on the phone almost every day, went out on dates once or twice a week, and almost always ended the evening making love. It wasn't just a night. I didn't know if it was love, but it was close. One of my friends, who had his own apartment, allowed me to use it on weekends when he went to his parents'. We made love 3 or 4 times a night before I had to take Lisa home. I wasn't her first, but she said the only guy she'd ever had before me was in Florida over spring break. A few weeks later, at the end of the school semester, the draft notice arrived almost simultaneously. I had to report to the recruiting center in 30 days. Lisa burst into tears when I told her about this and said that she loved me. Until that moment, I had avoided the word love, but I had to admit that I probably loved her too. A week before I was due to leave, Lisa and I were sitting together, and she seemed nervous. "Alan, I need to tell you something. I'm late." For a moment, I thought, oh damn. Neither of us brought it up, so I assumed she was safe and on the pill or something. I just sat there, trying to find the words. Lisa looked at the floor, and tears streamed down her face. I felt so sorry for her that I hugged and kissed her. After a while, she calmed down, and we began discussing our options. For some reason, neither of us mentioned marriage. We decided that if she was truly pregnant, we would either terminate the pregnancy or keep the baby and give it up for adoption. Anyway, one of Lisa's brothers and his wife lived in Alabama, so she thought she could go live with them for a while. She might be able to hide the pregnancy from her friends and the rest of her family. I said that this was probably the best option. I had some savings, and as soon as the army money started coming in, I could send her more. Neither of us was happy that night, and I drove her home without the usual passionate ending to the evening. A couple of days later, Lisa went to the doctor and confirmed that she was pregnant. We made preliminary plans for her to move south after I left for the army. I gave her almost everything I had in the bank, which, together with her savings, should have been enough for her needs. We spent the last evening before I left making love again and again in quiet desperation. When I took her home, Lisa snuggled up to me and whispered, "I'm so scared, Alan. I love you more than anything in the world." When I left, I felt as depressed as I had ever felt in my life. About 6 hours later, I and a couple of hundred other nervous, sleep-deprived, and in many cases hungover guys showed up at the recruiting center. After processing the paperwork, we were sworn in, given a lunchbox, loaded onto buses, and sent on a 10-hour trip to Fort Knox, Kentucky. We got off the bus around midnight, greeted by the shouts of half a dozen serious drill sergeants. We were quickly ushered through the linen line and directed to the old World War II barracks to sleep on bunks that were probably as old as the barracks themselves. During the Vietnam War, basic training in the Army included about 1 week of paperwork and orientation, followed by 6 weeks of military training. This was followed by additional training in the chosen specialty or the one that the Army selected for you. Basic training included all the usual things everyone has heard of: physical training, marksmanship training and qualifications, obstacle courses, drill, navigation, map reading, hygiene, and a variety of other necessary military topics. I learned that the secret to successfully completing basic training was to keep your mouth shut, follow orders, and sleep when you got the chance. We were always exhausted due to the high pace and tension. I was a couple of years older than the average recruit and had 2 years of college. Therefore, I was appointed squad leader after the first one burned out in the second week. He suddenly realized that he was a pacifist and against war. I think this realization came to him a little late. Meanwhile, Lisa wrote to me every day. The most important part of each day was the mail. One thing can be said about the army: it never stopped a soldier from receiving his mail. She wrote to me over and over again how much she loved me and told me how her move to Alabama was going, or more precisely, how it was not moving forward. She wrote that her daughter-in-law wears the pants in their family and is not very cooperative. She did not want to interfere in her problems and tried to convince Lisa to tell everything to her parents. Lisa's parents always treated me well, but they were real smoking, beer-drinking factory workers from the outback. Her father, brother, and brother-in-law were addicted to alcohol, cheated on their wives, and fought with anyone, anytime. If they didn't abuse their children, they at least neglected them. Her mother and sister spent most of their time trying to keep up with their men. Lisa was the youngest in the family and seemed to have escaped the worst influences of her family. She never liked beer and quit smoking as soon as she found out that I didn't like girls who smoke. However, I was haunted by the feeling that if they found out she was pregnant by me, nothing good would happen. As the weeks passed, I became completely absorbed in preparation, but every night I was haunted by letters from Lisa, who became increasingly desperate about the pregnancy. Between basic training and her letters, my stomach was constantly in knots. I often wrote back to her and called her when we were allowed to use the phone. Lisa continued to try to negotiate with her daughter-in-law, but to no avail. At that time, if your training went well, each company was promised a 48-hour rest after the 4th week. So, on Thursday, we were told that we would be released on Friday evening and would have to return only on Sunday evening. However, the conditions of the day off stated that you could not move more than 50 miles from the base, otherwise, you would be considered to have left the unit without permission. There were 6 guys in our platoon who lived in the same county and wanted to go home to see their wives or girlfriends. We chipped in to rent a car and hit the road. It was more than 500 miles to home, not 50. After 8 hours of driving, I was dropped off at my parents' house around 2 o'clock in the morning. I slept for 6 hours and then went to see Lisa. Her parents had gone to the lake where they had a trailer, so we could be alone. When she saw me at the door, she burst into tears and hugged me as if she thought she would never see me again. We went to her bedroom and made love. It got to the point that her daughter-in-law finally refused to help Lisa, and she was already almost 10 weeks pregnant when we made love for the last time that morning. Lisa cried and said, "I don't want to get rid of our baby." This made me stop halfway. I realized that I only had one option left. I realized that I couldn't leave her. Finally, I said, "Lisa, do you want to marry me?" This was far from the most romantic proposal, but I saw no other way out. She wiped away her tears and whispered, "I don't want you to feel like you have to marry me." I assured her that this was what I wanted and that it would be the best solution, even though I was afraid of it. I told her that I would tell my parents before I left for Fort Knox the next day. She had to tell her parents and start planning the wedding. I said that any decisions she made regarding the organization would be accepted by me without objection, but we couldn't set a wedding date until I knew where I was going after basic training. With the decision made, we were able to relax a little and think about what it meant. Was it love? I think so. I knew I wanted to be with her, and that's all that mattered. The next morning, I caught Mom and Dad before they left for church and told them the hardest part. What made this conversation easier was that my older brother had gotten married 2 years ago when his girlfriend got pregnant. The situation had been tense for some time, but then the parents reconciled, and everything somehow worked out. When the child was born, all was forgiven. I need to say a few words about my family. My father was a mid-level manager in production, and my mother was a housewife who worked part-time as a teacher's assistant. Everything was quite good for them financially. They always had a decent house and could provide for us 4 sons with everything we needed. They were active church members and participants in parent-teacher meetings. While I was growing up, my brothers and I were forced to attend church every Sunday. As soon as I was old enough to get a job, I realized that if I worked on Sundays, I could avoid going to church. That's why I always tried to work on that day. They did not smoke, rarely cursed, and drank. Family came first for them, and we never doubted that they loved us. When I told them that Lisa and I were going to get married, they had been through this before. Mom simply asked, "Do you have to?" "No, Mom, but Lisa is pregnant." Dad just looked gloomy, and Mom shook her head. "Have Lisa call me this week, and we can discuss your plans while you play soldier." Then they went to church. I visited Lisa again to spend a couple more hours with her and then met up with the guys for the ride back south. Before completing basic training, I received orders to Fort Polk, Louisiana, for additional individual training. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, decided that I should undergo 8 weeks of practical training to become an assistant in the post adjutant office. I always thought it was because I had 2 years of college and could type. The best part about this was that I could take up to 7 days off before starting the new position. I called Lisa and asked if this was enough time to organize the wedding. Lisa, her mother, and my mother had already prepared everything. We had a nice church wedding, not too big, with a reception after the ceremony. Lisa was a wonderful bride. The dress she chose was loose enough to hide her developing baby bump. Her father provided us with a keg of beer, and most of her relatives were drunk by the end of the evening. Lisa and I had a 3-day honeymoon, and then I boarded a plane to Fort Polk. We decided that Lisa would stay with her parents until I completed my training and received a permanent assignment. She also decided not to return to college and went back to work at the hospital, where she took a job as a junior administrator. Fort Polk was a real hole. It had recently been reactivated as an infantry training base due to Vietnam. It was hot, humid, and the cockroaches were the size of your thumb. But I worked indoors in an air-conditioned office, mostly as a typist, clerk, and errand boy. My time there passed quickly. 6 weeks later, I received orders to go to Germany at the end of my training. I couldn't believe my luck. Most of the guys after training were sent to Vietnam. I had some time before my new assignment, so I was able to spend 10 days at home. Lisa was 6 months pregnant but still incredibly attractive and constantly wanted intimacy. My plan was to request maternity leave as soon as I reported for my new duty. Lisa planned to stay with her parents until the last month of her pregnancy and then move in with my parents. They had a few extra rooms that were better suited for her and the baby. I flew to Germany and was assigned to a position as a maintenance clerk in an armored unit. It was another hands-on training, but it seemed easy. We were stationed at a small base near the East German border. This was at the height of the Cold War, and our unit's main mission was to patrol the border, which we did about 1 week out of 6. Over the next few months, I tried to keep things organized. I flew home a couple of days before Lisa's due date. She was huge. 4 days later, labor began. Everything went well, and soon we had a beautiful girl whom we named Maddie. When I first looked at her, I realized that my life would never be the same again. I spent the week after her birth enjoying every moment. We planned for Lisa and the baby to come to Germany as soon as Maddie was old enough to travel. Finally, everything came together, and about 3 months later, I met my family at Frankfurt Airport. Living in Germany as an ordinary soldier with a family was not easy. I was not entitled to military housing, so we rented an apartment in a small village about 10 kilometers from the base. I bought an old Volkswagen Beetle convertible that had the body painted in 3 different shades of blue and was probably on its 5th or 6th engine. Our furniture was old and worn, thrown out of military housing or left behind by other soldiers who were leaving. We didn't have a TV, just a multifunction radio. My salary was barely enough for basic needs, with a small reserve to go to the movies once a month. Gasoline was cheap, so most weekends we drove around the German countryside. Our only entertainment was each other. Maddie was a miracle. She was almost always happy and slept 10 to 12 hours a day. Lisa was a great mother, and of course, she spent the whole day with her daughter. But when I got home, I spent almost every waking minute playing with Maddie. When she was sleeping, Lisa and I were busy with each other. Our evenings were like the honeymoon we never had. For 10 months, except for the weeks when I had to go off on border patrol, we made love almost every night and in every possible way. I got to know Lisa's body better than my own, and what a body it was. After Maddie was born, she quickly regained her figure. Her hips were a little more rounded, her breasts a little fuller, although she still complained about their small size. But there was not a single stretch mark or spot on her body. It wasn't just an intimate, it seemed like we knew each other so well that we could finish each other's sentences. When we looked at each other, we almost always knew what the other was thinking. We never really fought, sometimes we disagreed, but we never got angry. We discussed everything, what we wanted from life, what we wanted from Maddie, and what we were going to do when we got home. We took care of each other and tried to make each other happy. The emotional connection we built convinced me that this was forever. I couldn't imagine my life without her, and I was sure that she felt the same. When my time in Germany was coming to an end, I was offered a promotion if I agreed to continue my service. But we both wanted to return to the States, be close to family and friends, go back to school, start a career, and move on with our lives. It was a great experience, and I was proud of my service, but it was time to move on. What a relief it was to return home after 2 years away. We lived with my parents for several months until we got back on our feet. I found a temporary second shift job at a local auto plant and re-enrolled in college. Between veterans benefits and jobs, things should have worked out for us. We bought a used car, rented a townhouse, and collected furniture from a variety of sources. Living with my parents placed serious restrictions on our nightlife, but when we moved into our own place, everything got better again. We never got back to the honeymoon rush we had in Germany, but it was still pretty great. 2 to 3 times a week had become our usual frequency, and we continued to enjoy love in many different ways. We had always been tender to each other, we held hands as we walked together, and we frequently cuddled on the couch while watching TV. From time to time, we brought up the topic of having another child, but neither of us was ready for it. We used to go out to rock clubs near campus with a few pairs of friends about twice a month. I must say that it took a lot of alcohol and a lot of people around who were also dancing for me to dance. After a few drinks, Lisa would take me to the dance floor, and we really got into it. Slow dancing didn't bother me. Being around Lisa and having her on the dance floor was an inspiration to me and made me better than I already was. But when it came to fast dancing, I was just an ordinary guy with white skin, a small set of movements, and a poor sense of rhythm. Lisa, on the other hand, could rock the place. She was typically dressed to kill and looked so hot that she could make a grown man cry. After a night at the club, I usually couldn't wait to get her home and into bed. In the following years, I continued to attend college part-time while working various jobs. Within a couple of semesters, I completed my associate's degree requirements and transferred to Michigan State University to pursue my undergraduate degree. I worked a few temporary second-shift jobs during the winter months, but during the warmer months, I primarily worked for a few construction firms. Strangely, I realized that what I liked best was working on construction sites. Working outdoors, operating heavy equipment, and doing physical labor brought me a lot of satisfaction. I met several other veterans at school who were doing much the same thing as I was. John and Craig were best friends and even served as best men at each other's weddings. We were all married and had small children. We started hanging out with a few other couples from time to time, barbecues, pool parties, and cooking competitions, mostly family events. Craig worked for a construction company owned by his wife's father, and John worked for several large construction companies in the area before and after his service, so he knew the construction business well. One day, John approached me with a proposal. We could each put down a couple thousand and register a construction company. We would combine his experience with mine, as well as my education in business and accounting. He proposed that we mainly focus on landscaping and possibly underground work at the initial stage. We could contract with several building contractors, including Craig's company. The idea of working for myself attracted me, and the opportunity to earn serious money was even more appealing. Lisa and I discussed this and decided to give it a try. Lisa took care of the children in our home until Maddie was 4 years old and started preschool. After that, she decided to return to work at the hospital. But basically, we lived from paycheck to paycheck. We had moved several times and now lived in a nice duplex. We had our own furniture, a 3-year-old car, and a 4-wheel drive pickup truck. That was almost all we had. The work was interesting, and we were busy for about 8 months of the year. We hired 4 to 5 people to work on projects as needed. Living in the snow belt brought most excavation work to a near standstill when the ground froze, but we received unemployment benefits during the winter months and did some cash work, so we were never poor. Of course, I was still receiving some VA benefits for tuition. At first, John and I would go to happy hours at various bars after work on Fridays for a few drinks. We were usually joined by a crowd of other builders, including Craig. John and Craig turned out to be pretty serious beer drinkers. I was happy with a slight inebriation after a couple of cocktails. It also turned out that both of them were quite active players when given the opportunity. I was shocked to learn that John regularly slept with one of the wives in our social circle, and Craig had an affair with the sister of one of the guys from our company. His greatest achievement, he said, was getting his wife's younger sister laid off in the first year of their marriage. Both of them freely admitted that they had tried to seduce almost every attractive woman they knew, and quite a few who weren't, often bragging about their exploits after a few drinks. I admit that these stories sometimes piqued my interest and made me wonder what it would be like to experience something new. From time to time during these happy hours, I would meet other women, have a drink with them, or even dance with them. But when I compared them to Lisa, they simply couldn't measure up. I didn't see the point in taking the risk when I had something better at home. I always looked forward to coming home to my wife. Around the time we started the business, disco was finally making its way to the Midwest, and our rock clubs gradually disappeared. Lisa completely immersed herself in the new music. Her dance experience allowed her to quickly master all the new dances. By the beginning of our second year in business, many of the rock bars had disappeared, and discotheques had taken their place. I went with Lisa to such establishments several times, but I just couldn't get into it. It wasn't only that I had no talent for dancing, but I also didn't feel comfortable in that environment. I was the guy who preferred flannel shirts and jeans over silk shirts and John Travolta-style suits. I had been working in construction for several years, and at 6 feet 3 inches, I weighed about 230 pounds. I was a big guy, but with a lot of muscle. I had broad shoulders, a strong chest, and big arms. In the off-season, I went to the local gym, where I played racquetball and did weightlifting to keep in shape. I had long hair and a full beard. Lisa said I looked like Paul Bunyan, and Maddie thought I was just a big teddy bear. But Lisa was completely different. She only became more beautiful with age. She could eat whatever she wanted and not gain an ounce. Lisa loved beautiful things and was a real fashionista. She could wear anything and still look pretty. One of the few things we argued about was how much she spent on her clothes. With her looks, talent for dancing, and charming personality, she fit perfectly into the disco atmosphere. Since I had no interest in disco, Lisa started going to clubs once a week with a few friends from work. They drank, enjoyed the music, and sometimes danced a little. This turned into me coming home from happy hour with the guys on Fridays around 7 or 8 in the evening, while Lisa would go meet her friends at one of the clubs for the rest of the night, and I would stay home with Maddie. Around the same time that Lisa became interested in discos, she started thinking about breast augmentation. One of our old neighbors, about her age, had this surgery, and Lisa was fascinated by how it changed her figure. I didn't think it was necessary and argued with her about it, but Lisa insisted that she considered herself flat and that after the operation, she would look better and feel more confident. Our insurance covered the hospitalization but did not cover the surgeon. Besides, it was not an expense we could afford. But she persistently pursued her goal, and in the end, she had the operation. The changes were not significant. Her breast size increased from 34B to 34C, but she looked really great and was very happy with the result. The construction season had come to an end, and we had completed our second full year in business. I worked from home, closed accounts, and prepared tax returns and reporting forms. We had been busy for 8 of the last 12 months, made a profit, paid all our bills, and had some money in the bank. But when I added up all the hours John and I put in for the year, we only made about 50 cents an hour. It certainly wasn't the big deal I was expecting. Lisa and I were discussing buying a house. We were tired of renting. Maddie was 6 years old and starting first grade, and there was again talk of getting her a brother or sister. Lisa did a good job at the hospital. She changed positions several times, received promotions, and increased her salary each time. In truth, her income was probably more than my combined income from work, unemployment benefits, and VA benefits. This year, I was starting to wonder where our construction business was going. I only had a few courses left to complete my bachelor's degree. Maybe you should think about doing something else, I thought. Then, right after Thanksgiving, I answered that anonymous call that changed everything. As I sat there trying to cope with the nausea, all this kept popping into my head. I kept muttering to myself, what the hell? I didn't want to believe that there might be some truth in this, but something inside me told me that I was missing something. Something had changed this year. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my thoughts. I needed a plan, and I needed to be ready for when he called again. I took a notepad and started making a list of questions that I needed answers to. After a while, I just sat there and stared at the piece of paper, hoping it would all just go away. When the phone rang, I was startled. I grabbed the phone and said, "Hello? Are you alone now?" asked the voice. "Yes." "Your wife, Lisa, goes to Extra Point on Fridays, doesn't she?" the caller asked. Yes. She's been dating a man there named Dan Burris for a few months now." Damn. When he said his name, it seemed more real. "How do you know?" He chuckled. "They don't really hide it. Their whole company is aware of what's going on." Damn it. My thoughts raced between disbelief, anger, panic, and denial. Why are you telling me this? Are you mad at this guy, and that's why you made this up? Or did you try to hit on Lisa, and she rejected you? He got angry at this. I'm not making this up, and it's none of your business why. I just thought you should know. Yes, of course, I answered after a short pause. When and where does this happen most often? They get out into his minivan somewhere between 11 and 12. He has a real bedroom on wheels there. They usually don't come back to the club with an unpleasant feeling. I remembered waking up and hearing Lisa come home after 2 in the morning a couple of Fridays, and then I just went back to sleep. Later, when I asked her about it, she simply shrugged and said that she stayed for the band's last show. How long has this been going on? I heard that it started around midsummer, maybe earlier. Is this Dan married? Yes, but he says his wife doesn't mind. Do they meet somewhere else or something? Several times. They didn't stay in the parking lot after they left the club. I heard him say that they went to his house one day, and they met for lunch a few times. He paused, then added, and there was also a weekend on a sailing yacht. A weekend on a yacht? What are you talking about? It seems that one weekend in August, Dan, Lisa, and 2 other couples went on a large sailing yacht to Lake Michigan. I heard they had a lot of fun there. Damn it! It felt like a big puzzle, and one piece fit together to form the whole picture. In August, my parents asked me to come to their dacha by the lake and help build a terrace. Lisa had to work at the hospital on Sundays, and she usually worked one Sunday a month. It happened to be her shift that weekend. I left on Friday night and took Maddie with me. Mom and Dad were always happy to see their granddaughter. Lisa said she planned to go to the beach in Grand Haven on Saturday with a friend named Connie, who also worked at the hospital. She also mentioned that she might be staying the night at Connie's and driving from there to work on Sunday morning. Can't be. Lisa is afraid of water. She barely agrees to set foot on a pontoon boat. Maybe they never left the marina, but whatever they did, I heard it was a great party. The awareness of the possible consequences of this story began to penetrate my consciousness. If this is true, then Lisa lied to me, and if she lied about that, what else could she lie about? Where does this Dan Burris live? Oh no, I'm not going to be responsible for you doing something stupid. Besides, his number is in the phone book. What does he look like? He's about 6 feet 1 inch or 6 feet 2 inches, probably weighs about 180 pounds. He is 32 years old and has blonde hair combed back. He's in good physical shape, a good dancer, decent looking, a real seducer, and earns a lot of money. Anything else you know about them? Well, from what I've heard, I have a feeling he's not the first. She is quite popular in their circle, but now Dan is taking all her attention. To be honest, she's the first person he talked about as the woman he's in love with. Damn. He's talking about my wife. I started to feel nauseous. I said furiously, I can't believe this. Lisa is not like that. Hey man, I'm sorry to hear this, but if I were you, I'd want to know, he said with some degree of sympathy, which only made me feel worse. Yes, of course. I hung up the phone with a bang. I don't know how long I sat there, but the next moment Maddie was already returning from school. I came to my senses a little, hugged her tightly, and praised her for the drawings she brought from school. In the end, I sat her down with a snack and cartoons in front of the TV. Watching her, I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I began to think about what might await us. Is it really possible that Lisa could be involved in something like this? Lisa was supposed to return home in a couple of hours. While preparing dinner, I replayed the conversation in my head over and over again. The caller knew too many details to ignore. I decided I didn't want to have a confrontation just yet, partly out of fear of the unknown and partly out of hope and prayer that this was all just a misunderstanding. But whatever it was, I had to find out the truth. As I thought about the call, I began to reflect on what had changed in the last year or two. Lisa had always been a little flirty. She communicated with anyone and was not shy. She loved dirty jokes as much as anyone we knew. I knew she liked attention from other men. We had discussed and laughed about this many times. I never believed that anything could come of it. When I was drinking with the guys, the conversation about intim always started sooner or later. Lisa was probably one of the most beautiful women in our group. A couple of times, when the guys were tipsy, I heard hints and rumors about her flirting and indirect references to the fact that she was allegedly cheating. I always attributed these comments to alcohol and jealousy. Maybe there was something more behind this. Another thing I noticed was that when Lisa first started going clubbing with her friends, she would always be back before midnight. Sometimes I was still awake and she wanted to make love. Sometimes she even woke me up. If we didn't make love when she got home, we probably did it in the morning. But when she started coming back later and later, all this stopped. We no longer made love on Saturdays. Sundays had become the norm. In fact, she rarely got up before 11 on a Saturday unless I was working and she had to keep an eye on Maddie. Another thing I've noticed over the past year is that Lisa has become significantly more confident than ever before. Maybe it had something to do with her improved figure or the way she started dressing more professionally in line with her latest promotion at work. It seemed she was no longer as interested in trips to my parents' dacha as before. I had the feeling that she was less interested in what I was doing and how things were going in the construction business. One of the things I did while waiting for Lisa to return was get out the phone book and look up Dan Burris's number. I found a record of Daniel and Patricia Burris in Grand Ledge, a nearby affluent suburb. When I saw this post, a chill came over me again. I wrote down the number and address, collected all my notes from the call, and put them in my briefcase. I put on a mask and tried to act as if nothing unusual had happened that day. Somehow, I survived the evening. Lisa was as affectionate as always. She kissed me when she walked in the door. I kept looking at her, trying to see if I noticed something different, but I didn't see anything. She chatted about her day in the hospital and our friend's upcoming Christmas party. She laughed and played with Maddie, who wanted to put up a Christmas tree, and we tried to convince her that it was too early for that. Later that night, I just lay in bed trying to forget everything. Lisa hugged me as usual and immediately fell asleep. The next morning, after Maddie left for school and Lisa left for work, I took out my notes. I reviewed everything again and collected all my thoughts. I decided that I needed to search the house for evidence. I went through Lisa's closets and chests of drawers, rummaged through our boxes of stuff in the basement, and checked our old credit card bills, phone bills, and checking statements. Nothing suspicious. I looked through our folder of correspondence, note cards, and all kinds of small pieces of paper, but again found nothing. Then I took our address pad that we kept for contacts and started looking through it. Nothing caught my attention until I got to the Z section. Like most people, we didn't know anyone with a last name starting with Z. However, on the second blank page after the letter Z, I found about half a dozen pencil notes in Lisa's handwriting. They were just initials followed by 1 or 2 phone numbers. One of the entries was DB, and the first number matched Dan Burris's number listed in the phone book. It was like a punch to the stomach. I just sat and looked at this page, feeling despair overcome me. At first, I felt angry, then came sadness and depression. As incredible as it may seem, I was forced to admit that my wife led a secret life that I didn't even know existed, a life that may have included behavior completely contrary to our marriage vows. She cared so little about me that she even wrote down the evidence in our shared address pad. I was forced to believe that the story the unknown caller told me was mostly true. If this is so, Can I close my eyes to it? Will I be able to forgive her? I realized with horror that we would probably never be able to go back to the way things were before. What about Maddie? Whatever happens, she will suffer the most. With the evidence I had, I knew I could figure out who, what, and where, but I could only find out why through direct confrontation with Lisa. I had 3 days left before she went to the club again on Friday. I had to get as many answers as possible before that time. I should have known my options, and I had to be ready to make a decision and follow through. I couldn't let this drag on, it was eating me up from the inside. I had a high school friend who graduated from law school. He clerked for a local judge while waiting to take the bar exam. I called him, and he referred me to a divorce lawyer who would provide me with a free consultation. I made an appointment for Friday morning. I started calling the numbers found in our address pad to see who else might be involved. It was easy. I could pretend I had dialed the wrong number or pretend to be a salesperson over the phone. I was worried about the second number under the initials DB. It was the number of an office equipment service company. Judging by the secretary's words, Dan was a sales representative. The rest of the names associated with the numbers were unfamiliar to me, except for CM. It turned out to be the number of her friend Connie from the hospital. That evening, I told Lisa that I needed to visit a construction site that we were going to apply for, and I would be back in a couple of hours. I drove to the Burris house and parked a few doors down. It was a comfortable residential area. When I arrived, there was one car in the driveway, a brand new BMW. About 20 minutes later, a burgundy Chevrolet minivan drove into the driveway. A well-dressed man matching the description of Dan Burris got out and walked into the house. Now I could relate the name to the face. I drove past slowly and wrote down his car number. Getting through the rest of the week was not easy. I avoided going to bed when Lisa went to bed. Just the thought of making love to her made me depressed. Lisa sensed that I was tense and kept asking if everything was okay. I told her I was feeling pressure to finish my tax forms early and balance my accounts. She accepted my version without comment. In fact, neither the IRS nor my partner, John, cared if everything was filed by April 15th. I tried to spend as much time as possible with Maddie. I was afraid of the change that might happen in the future. At dinner on Thursday night, Lisa casually asked, "Are you going to happy hour on Friday as usual?" As I walked, I answered, "I don't know. For some reason, I don't feel like it this week. Maybe we can skip this Friday and do something together. Maybe the three of us can go somewhere." Without blinking an eye, she replied, "Darling, it's too late to change plans. I promised Connie I'd meet her at the club. She will bring a friend whom she wants to introduce me to. This friend is interested in a vacancy that is open in our hospital." I just sat there and felt so depressed. She stooped to this, making up stories so as not to miss a meeting with her lover. My feelings probably showed on my face. "Oh, Alan, we can do something together on Saturday or Sunday. It's not the end of the world," she laughed. I smiled and said, "You're right. It's not the end of the world. It's not the end of the world, but it might be the end of our marriage." On Friday morning, I met with a lawyer and explained my situation to him as I saw it. I needed to know what my legal options were. His first question was, "Is reconciliation possible?" I replied that this was possible, but everything would depend on what would come out of the upcoming confrontation. He explained that we lived in a no-fault divorce state. This means that the reasons for the divorce are not relevant to its approval. The reasons may be important when dividing property, assigning alimony, and determining child custody. Given that Lisa's income is equal to or greater than mine, alimony should not be an issue. Since our assets were minimal, dividing the property should not pose a problem. Regarding custody, if it comes to divorce, I would like to get joint custody of Maddie. In the event that Lisa decides to contest this, evidence of her infidelity or her unfitness as a mother could dissuade her from doing so. I told the lawyer that I could provide something to back it up. When I returned home, I began to feel the need to share what was happening with someone. I needed someone who could convince me that I wasn't exaggerating, that it really was as bad as I thought it was. I was too embarrassed and confused to tell anyone in my family. I thought about John and Craig, but given their attitude toward fidelity, I doubted I would get good advice from them. Besides, I couldn't trust them not to spill the beans after a few drinks. My plans for the evening were already set, so after completing some accounting work, I headed to the bar for happy hour. My thoughts were far away, and after one drink, I switched to ginger ale and just watched everything happening around me. The view was depressing. Is this really what awaits me, hanging out in bars looking for company? Marriage has brought me a lot of good things. It has made me happy, and at least I thought everything was fine. It turns out I was blind. In the end, I gave up and went home. I pulled up to the house before 7 o'clock, and Maddie greeted me at the door, jumping into my arms and hugging me tightly. Dad, you're home. Lisa came out of the bedroom dressed but still finishing her makeup. She looked at me carefully, as if trying to figure out if I was sober. I fed Maddie dinner leftovers from the stove. I'll meet Connie for dinner before we go to the club, I just mumbled in response and headed toward the kitchen. Maddie chatted about school and showed me her drawings while I heated up my dinner. As I sat there with Maddie, Lisa came into the room wearing a coat, looking beautiful as always. My heart sank in pain when I thought about what she was doing to us. She kissed us both and said, "You two have fun today. Love you both." Maddie replied, "I love you, Mommy," and I just said, "Bye." I wanted to ask her to stay, but it would be pointless. Lisa stopped at the door for a second and looked at me with a strange expression, as if she wanted to say something. Then she opened the door and went out. I waited about 15 minutes, listening to her car drive away, and then called the babysitter I had arranged for in advance. I told her to come in 20 minutes, then I sat down with Maddie and said, "How would you like Carol to come and sit with you for a while?" Maddie adored Carol and agreed. "You have to be a good girl and go to bed when she tells you to, okay?" Maddie nodded vigorously. I went into the bathroom and got out my shaving supplies. I started shaving my beard and mustache. Where was I going tonight? I didn't want to be recognized. Maddie came in and looked at me. "Dad, what are you doing with your face?" "I'm making it smooth like it was before you came along, darling." "Do you like it?" I had grown a beard right after I got out of the army, and she didn't remember me without it. "I think so," but she sounded unsure. My hair was still long, but I combed it back and out of my face. I gathered the things I would need, and as soon as Carol arrived, I said I had to leave but would be back between 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the morning. I kissed and hugged Maddie and left. I went to my brother's house to change vehicles. He had asked a few weeks ago if he could borrow a pickup truck to move some things, and a couple of days before, I told him that he could take it that Friday night if he would let me use his car. This suited both of us. He was also something of an amateur photographer, and I asked him to lend me a camera and a zoom lens with film that would work in low light. He asked what I was going to film, but I just said I'd tell him if it worked out. He set everything up, gave me some tips, and then I was on my way. It was snowing when I pulled into the club parking lot around 8:30. I drove through the parking lot until I came across her car in the very corner, in a dark place. I didn't see the burgundy van, so I thought they might still be having dinner. I hoped they didn't decide to go elsewhere. I parked where I had a clear view through the side window and waited. About 30 minutes later, the van pulled up with another car behind it. Both cars parked next to Lisa's car. Lisa and Dan got out of the van, and the other couple got out of the car. I didn't know the man, but I recognized the woman. It was Connie. Lisa had introduced me to her a couple of times. She was a pretty blonde, divorced, and a couple of years younger than us. Lisa and Dan walked holding hands, laughing and talking, looking at each other with obvious tenderness. I took a couple of photos as they walked past me toward the entrance. Watching them, I felt sick to my stomach again. I waited a few minutes and got out of the car. I dressed differently than usual, khaki pants and a shirt, and I threw on a long dark raincoat with a raised collar and a Panama hat. I decided that if I kept my head down, the visor would hide my face. The disco crowd dressed quite eclectically, so I thought I wouldn't stand out if I stayed in the background. I hung the camera around my neck and hid it under my coat. I walked up to the entrance and paid for admission. I walked straight to the bar, looking out from under the brim of my hat just enough to find my way. I bought a Coke and started looking around. I thought that if they came to dance, they would be close to the dance floor and the DJ. I noticed them ahead, they pushed a couple of tables together and sat with 6 or 8 other people. I made my way around the crowded bar, trying to stay close to the wall. I found a table with one bar stool against the wall about 30 feet behind them. It had a good view of their table and the dance floor. I wasn't worried about being recognized. The only lights in the club were on the dance floor and bar, making it almost impossible to see anyone in the distance. It was obvious that they all knew each other. The women were hugging and kissing on the cheeks, and the guys were laughing and joking. Besides Lisa and Dan, I only recognized Connie. I wondered if someone from this group was the one who told me everything. The music played, and most of the group took to the dance floor as couples. For the next 3 hours, I watched Lisa and her lover. Within the first hour, it became clear that the word lovers accurately described their relationship. They danced, kissed, and hugged. They whispered in each other's ears. They danced together as if they had been partners all their lives. God knows how many hours they must have practiced fast dancing and slow dances. They literally merged in their arms as if they were one. I saw Lisa look into his eyes as she had once looked into mine. I just sat there, choking with a lump in my throat, constantly wiping tears from my eyes. As they sat at the table, he kept his hand on her leg, and she slowly stroked his hair, her wedding rings glinting in the light as if mocking me. As the evening went on, they became more and more affectionate, and I knew how it would end. They were in their own world, sharing their innermost thoughts. After 3 hours, I was emotionally exhausted. I intended to follow them to his van and witness how the evening ended, but I couldn't take it anymore. I had an answer, and it was bitter. It was not just a physical relationship, but also a deep emotional connection. What I thought we shared only with each other, she freely gave to him. She had already left me. I realized that there could be no satisfactory explanation or solution to this situation. I had seen enough, and I had secretly taken enough photographs to prove to myself later, or to anyone else, that it was not a figment of my imagination. I took a piece of paper out of my pocket and wrote on it in my bold handwriting, which she instantly recognized. "Don't come home today. I don't want to see you. The doors will be locked. Go to your mom, your sister, or stay with Dan. It doesn't matter anymore. Don't call me today. I won't talk to you. Call tomorrow if you have something to tell me. Tell me tomorrow." I carefully folded the note, got up, and walked over to the bar. I stood there for a few minutes and watched blankly as Lisa and Dan began to put on their coats. A waitress walked by, and I said, "Do you want to make $20 in tips?" She looked at me like I was crazy. I continued impatiently, "See that woman near the dance floor in the green dress and black coat? Oh, of course. It's Lisa. I know her and her boyfriend too," she said. Disgusted, I replied, "Great, just great. Here's $20. Just go and give her this piece of paper." She took the paper and the $20, looked at me, shrugged, and headed toward the dance floor. I walked up to the exit, turned, and watched numbly as the waitress walked up to Lisa and handed her the note. Lisa said something to her, and the waitress answered something and pointed to the bar. Lisa unfolded the sheet of paper, and one of her hands rose to her lips. I could almost hear her scream over the loud music. She then slowly sank to the floor as her stunned lover tried to keep her on her feet. I turned wearily and walked out into the cold, snowy night. When I drove home, I could barely see the road through my tears. It was the saddest day of my life. Everything I believed in was destroyed. Lisa was everything I needed, and I was once everything Lisa needed. Why had everything changed? Was all this just a fairy tale? Were the signs always there, and was I too complacent and too caught up in my own world to see them? I got home before midnight. I paid Carol, thanked her, and sent her home. I looked into Maddie's room and was again struck by how beautiful and special she was. I tried not to think about what the next days or weeks would bring. The phone rang, and I unplugged all the cords from the sockets, bolted the doors, and went to bed. I was so exhausted that I fell asleep instantly. Surprisingly, I slept for about 7 hours and felt better than I deserved. Maddie would probably sleep for at least another hour, so I began my preparations. I knew I was in for another grueling day. Around noon, I plugged my phone back in. A few minutes later, it rang. When I picked up the phone, I heard Lisa's voice trembling. Can I go home now? I replied, the door is not locked, and hung up. I began to think about what was coming, and I realized that the only way to deal with it was to harden my heart, let out my anger, and demand answers. From the day I met Lisa, I had never raised my voice to her, and I had never felt anything but love for her. About 20 minutes later, she walked through the front door. Sitting in the kitchen, I could watch her. She looked around nervously as if hoping to see Maddie. Finally, she walked slowly across the living room, throwing her coat on a chair. She saw me at the dining table, where I often worked, with my briefcase and business documents in front of me. We both looked at each other in silence for several minutes. Finally, I said, "Sit down." She sat down in a chair and asked, "Where's Maddie?" "She's with my parents. They'll be looking after her tonight." Lisa nodded slowly. She looked carefully at my face for the first time in many years. "I see you're clean-shaven," I said simply. Lisa looked exhausted, as if she had not slept. The makeup was all washed off, and her eyes were red and swollen. "Whose car is in the driveway?" "My brother's. He's using the truck to help someone move over the weekend." After everything that could be discussed was exhausted, we sat in silence for several minutes. Lisa could hardly look me in the eye. Finally, she cleared her throat and said, "Alan, what you saw last night is not what it seems." I just stared at her in disbelief. Was she really going to try to get out of it with lies? It was clear. I pulled our address pad out from under the stack of papers and opened it to the Z section, holding it in front of her. I pointed to the initials she had written there. Jerry Drew is a broker, Sharon Hughes is a real estate agent, and Steve Ostrander owns his own auto repair shop. Do you think honesty is important to them? Do you think any of them would lie under oath if they were called to testify in a divorce proceeding? The shock on her face gave way to tears. She covered her face with her hands and leaned over the table. "Oh God, no! I was there from the moment you arrived at the club to the moment you read my note. I know where you were going and who you were with. I just didn't have the strength to follow you to his van." I watched her shake her head in disbelief. "Lisa, I want to hear the truth from you, the whole truth, from the beginning of our marriage until today. If you try to lie to me, I will find out. Many things have become clear to me this week, and I want to know everything." I almost screamed in her face as I finished. Lisa shrank in her chair and turned away from me. She started to get up, but I grabbed her wrists. "Sit down. You won't get away from this, or from me." She collapsed back into the chair and covered her face with her hands, refusing to look at me. I stood up and poured some vodka and tomato juice into a glass, placing it in front of her. I wanted her to speak up and speak frankly. I knew she couldn't handle conflict. This, combined with emotional shock and a little vodka, I hoped would help reveal the truth. After a while, she lowered her hands and looked at me pleadingly. "Alan, please, I love you." She closed her eyes and shook her head from side to side. "God, I never thought this would happen." "What?" "That you'll cheat on me or get caught." "I think I know which," I said sharply. She started crying again. I waited a little. Finally, I said, "Tell me about Dan." She began to wipe her eyes and took a sip. Almost in a whisper, she said, "I met Dan at a club. He was one of the guys in the group that we always sat with. We danced a lot together and just felt a mutual attraction." "That's certainly putting it mildly," I said sharply. "When did you start sleeping with him?" She flinched when I said this. She turned away from me and said slowly, "We started sleeping together around June. He is married, they have no children. He is older than us. He and his wife have an open marriage. And I'm sure you just forgot to tell him that you and I don't have an open marriage." "Really?" Lisa didn't say anything. "Come on, Lisa, you're missing something important, aren't you? He makes a lot of money, he wears expensive clothes, he and his wife have expensive cars and live in a very expensive house." She looked at me in shock. "How did you know?" "I've been working on it a little. This is a select group of people. You found yourself in a completely different life than ours, or at least than mine." She gulped down the rest of her drink, and I stood up to pour her another. "Tell me, where did this dream happen and how often?" She dropped her head into her hands. She started speaking so quietly that I had to strain my ears to hear. Usually every time after the club, we would go to his van and... She trailed off. What is it? Hard for you to describe? Have fun or even make love? After what I saw last night, it's obvious that you are lovers, I said bitterly. Anyway, it's too late to try to spare my feelings. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. What do you want me to say, Alan? I want you to say sorry or that it was a mistake. I screamed. But an affair that lasts for almost 6 months is not a mistake, is it? And the only thing you regret is that you got caught. She started crying again and didn't say a word. Where else did you go? To his house? To our house? To hotels or motels? She wiped her nose and took another sip. We've been to his house once, to a motel a couple of times, but never to our house. In his house and in his bed? I asked. She simply nodded. Where was Mrs. Dan? She was away for the weekend. What else, Lisa? Come on, don't be shy. I'm sure there's something else. She was silent for several minutes, nervously clutching her glass and looking into it. We met for lunch sometimes. No intimate, just lunch, I asked quietly. Anything else? She shook her head. I slammed my fist on the table. You're forgetting about your weekend on the sailing yacht. I didn't think Lisa could turn any more pale, but she was clearly on the verge of fainting. I grabbed her as she began to sink to the floor. Recovering, she took a sip of her drink, put her head in her hands, and began to cry again. Finally, she whispered, How did you know about this? Shaking my head, I said, Lisa, do you understand? You were caught. You were given away. There are no more secrets. Now tell me about that weekend when you were too busy with work to go north with your husband and daughter. A trembling Lisa wrapped her arms around herself. Dan is a friend who has a sailboat docked in Saugatuck. He invited Dan and me, along with Connie and her boyfriend, to go sailing for the weekend. You were already planning to work for your parents, so I said that I had to work to go, and you took Maddie with you. I looked at her with disgust. I guess you weren't afraid to outright lie to me anymore. How ironic that you practically refused to get on a boat on the tiny lake where Mom and Dad have a house, but you're willing to spend the weekend sailing on Lake Michigan. Without looking at me, she said, we didn't really swim much. The water was calm, and we sailed along the coast, anchoring about half a mile offshore. I also drank a few cocktails, which helped me relax. I just stared at her. So what were you doing on a yacht at anchor with such privacy and complete relaxation? Running around the boat without any clothes? Almost stuttering, she said, We sunbathed without clothes, but we were intimate a couple of times in the cabin. She fell silent for a second, and I continued to look at her silently. Later, when Dan and I stayed overnight on the yacht in the marina, she added, closing her eyes. And again when we went out on Sunday. I felt a sharp pain in my stomach when I remembered that we had not been intimate that Sunday evening when I returned home. In fact, Lisa went to bed early, saying she wasn't feeling well. The only time I remembered was when we missed the weekend she had women's days. Now I knew why. Sarcastically, I said, Wow, what a packed weekend you had. You just don't have any energy left to share with your poor husband who hasn't seen his loving wife for 3 days. Lisa didn't say anything, she just started crying and shaking her head again. We sat for a while, Lisa quietly sobbing, and I was lost in my thoughts. Finally, I stood up and poured her another drink, placing it in front of her. I no longer had to force myself to be angry, I was genuinely angry. Lisa, I said, we're not done yet. Crying, she said, please, I told you everything. Somehow, I doubted that. It occurred to me that perhaps you so easily entered into this long-term affair and hid it because this wasn't your first betrayal. Have you cheated on me before? Lisa looked at me with her mouth open, trying to say something. She then closed it and turned away, trying to speak again. It was obvious that she was trying to figure out how much she could get away with, and in her condition, it was a difficult task. I shook my head. Lisa, don't try to lie to me again. It won't work. Other people have told me about you for years, but I didn't believe them. I refused to believe it, not from my loving wife. I want to know everything, and I want to know now. Lisa fell back into her chair, her eyes dull and half closed. Exhaustion and defeat were written on her face and in her posture. In a monotone voice, she said, "Before Dan, I dated another guy from the club just a couple of times, and then he stopped going there." "And who were they?" I asked. She opened her eyes and whispered, "You know, don't you?" I gritted my teeth and said, "Tell me." She said, "John and Craig." I almost physically felt how this piece of the puzzle fell into place. Suspicion had been swirling around in my head for the past few days. Lisa was probably the most attractive woman in our social circle, and if John and Craig hit on every beautiful woman they knew, why didn't they hit on her? Of course, they pestered me, but Lisa never told me about this. She would share if they made her uncomfortable or if they failed to get her attention. John and Craig wouldn't tell me about this, but they hinted at it after a few bottles of beer, and I was too gullible to take them seriously. My wife betrayed me. She betrayed me with two people I considered my best friends, and one of them was my business partner. Sarcastically, I said, "Did you study with them at the same time or separately?" She just stared ahead, unfocused. "Do you remember when Craig got pulled over by a cop a mile from here for drunk driving? The cop let him go because he said he was going to see his girlfriend just a few blocks away." I chuckled, knowing what would happen next. He came over, and we had a drink. Maddie had already been asleep for several hours. The policeman followed him here and did not leave. He was just sitting in his car in front of the entrance. Craig suggested turning off all the lights and pretending that we had gone to bed, and we did. What do you think of our first part of the story? I feel sorry for my husband, because one phone call practically ruined his life. What do you think about that? Write in the comments. See you in the next video.